Rattlesnake Wells, the Apache Siren's deadly midnight challenge. Miguel Santos had always been fascinated by the stories that people whispered about the desert. He grew up hearing tales from his grandfather, who spoke of the strange, sometimes frightening things that happened near Rattlesnake Wells, a remote water source deep in the Arizona desert. Locals called it haunted, cursed, or touched by spirits. But Miguel never believed in curses or ghosts. What he did believe in was history, danger, and the unknown waiting to be discovered. And Rattlesnake Wells promised all three. He first heard the story of the Apache Siren from an old desert guide named Carlos, who had worked in the area for decades. Carlos described the siren as a mysterious figure who appeared only at night, usually near midnight. People said she lured travelers with a strange, almost hypnotic singing voice, drawing them closer to the well. Many who ventured near after dark never returned. Some were found days later, injured or frightened, while others simply disappeared. The story sounded like one of those legends meant to scare children, but Miguel had learned to pay attention to legends. They often had a grain of truth buried inside them. Miguel was not a man to be easily scared. He was a ranger trained to navigate deserts, mountains, and forests. He had studied the terrain, the animals, and the hidden dangers that could catch the unprepared by surprise. But he had never faced a challenge like this. The desert at night was not forgiving. The temperatures could drop suddenly, rattlesnakes would stir in the shadows, and there were hidden cliffs and pits where a careless step could mean injury or death. Yet the thought of finally discovering what was behind the Apache Siren legend filled him with a mix of fear and excitement. It was a challenge he could not ignore. Miguel spent days preparing. He collected supplies, extra water, a first aid kit, a strong flashlight, a camera, and a notebook. He carefully studied maps of the area and read reports of past incidents near Rattlesnake Wells. Most of the reports were vague, but one thing stood out. Almost all the incidents happened at night, and many people mentioned hearing a singing voice before something bad happened. That detail fascinated Miguel. Could the sound have a natural explanation, or was it something more? He did not know yet, but he was determined to find out. On the morning of his journey, the desert sun was high and the heat pressed down on everything. Miguel felt a familiar sense of calm. The desert, though harsh, had always been a place where he could think clearly. He drove his old, dusty truck along the long, winding dirt roads that led to Rattlesnake Wells. The landscape was breathtaking. Red rock formations rose like towers, desert bushes swayed slightly in the wind, and the distant mountains cast long shadows that shifted as the day went on. Despite the beauty, Miguel remained alert. He knew how quickly the desert could become dangerous, especially after dark. As he neared the well, the roads grew narrower and rockier. The signs of human presence faded. There were no houses, no other vehicles, only the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The air became cooler, and a quiet tension settled over the land. Miguel parked his truck at a safe distance from the well, careful not to draw attention to himself. He stepped out, checking his equipment one last time. His flashlight worked perfectly. The camera had full batteries, and the notebook was ready for notes. Everything was in order, but a small part of him wondered what he would find once the sun went down. Miguel sat for a while, observing the well from a distance. Rattlesnake Wells was a simple structure, a low stone wall surrounding an old water pit. The water inside was dark, reflecting the fading sunlight. The area around the well was overgrown with desert plants, dry and brittle. There were footprints near the edge, some recent, some older. This confirmed what Miguel had read. People still came here, perhaps seeking adventure, perhaps ignoring the warnings about the Apache Siren. He felt a shiver, but he told himself it was only the wind or the setting sun playing tricks on his mind. As evening approached, Miguel noticed a subtle change in the desert. The air seemed heavier, almost electric. Birds had stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to pause for a moment. Shadows grew long and deep, and the temperature began to drop quickly. Miguel checked his watch. It was still early evening, but night would come soon. He decided to use the last hour of daylight to explore the area around the well. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for footprints, broken branches, or any sign that someone, or something, had passed through recently. While walking, Miguel found small, curious details. There were flattened patches of grass that could not have been made naturally. Small stones were arranged in patterns that suggested human presence. A broken piece of pottery, perhaps decades old, lay half-buried in the sand. Each discovery added to the mystery, and Miguel felt a mix of excitement and caution. He knew that legends often grew from real events, and these small clues hinted at the stories he had heard. As the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon, the desert turned a deep, velvety blue. Stars began to shine one by one, filling the sky with a glittering pattern. Miguel checked his flashlight and put it in his pocket, ready for the night ahead. He knew that after dark, everything changed. The well, the desert, and even the wind could become dangerous. Miguel reminded himself of the stories. People had gone missing, strange sounds had been heard, and many who claimed to have seen the Apache Siren spoke of an almost hypnotic presence. He felt his heart rate increase, not with fear but with anticipation. Midnight approached slowly. Miguel settled near the edge of the well, taking careful notes and observing everything. He noticed small movements, a shadow darting between bushes, a faint glow of insects, and the distant rhythmic call of a coyote. Then, very faintly, he thought he heard something else, a soft, melodic sound carried by the wind. It was distant at first, almost like a whisper. Miguel froze, listening carefully. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before, and it seemed to come from the direction of the well. Miguel's instincts told him to be cautious. He slowly raised his camera, trying to capture anything unusual. The sound grew slightly louder, a haunting tune that seemed to float over the desert. His mind raced. Was this the Apache Siren? Could it be a person playing a prank, or something natural, like the wind moving through rocks? He did not know, but he felt that the moment he had been preparing for had arrived. He had finally stepped into the story, into the legend, and the desert held its breath around him. As Miguel watched, he realized that this was only the beginning. The well, the desert, and the strange voice promised challenges he could not yet imagine. He felt a mixture of fear, curiosity, and determination. He knew that to uncover the truth, he would have to face the night, the desert, and whatever waited at Rattlesnake Wells. And in that moment, under the vast starry sky, Miguel understood that legends were never just stories. They were invitations to discover something greater, something real hiding beneath the surface. Miguel took a deep breath, adjusted his flashlight, and prepared for what lay ahead. The desert was alive in ways most people never saw, and Rattlesnake Wells was its most mysterious secret. Tonight, he would begin to uncover it. Night had fallen fully over the desert, and the world around Rattlesnake Wells had changed completely. Shadows stretched in every direction, blending with the shapes of rocks and desert bushes. Miguel Santos felt the cool air brush against his face, carrying the scent of dry earth and desert plants. The once bright landscape of day was now a dark, mysterious place where every sound seemed sharper and every movement more meaningful. He knew that the desert at night could be both beautiful and dangerous, and he was ready to face it. Miguel adjusted the straps of his backpack and took a careful step toward the well. His flashlight illuminated only a small circle of ground ahead, leaving the rest in deep darkness. Each footstep was deliberate, avoiding sharp rocks and loose sand. He could hear the distant call of a coyote and the occasional rustle of small desert animals moving through the brush. The sound of his own breathing felt unusually loud in the stillness, reminding him that he was alone. But despite the isolation, Miguel felt a strange calm. He had trained for situations like this, and he trusted his instincts. As he approached the well, Miguel noticed more signs of recent activity. Footprints led toward the water, some fresh, some older, pressed into the hard earth. Broken twigs and crushed desert plants marked a path he could follow carefully. There were even small objects left behind: an empty water bottle, a torn piece of cloth, and a crushed can. Each item told a story, hinting that people had been here recently, perhaps drawn by curiosity or by the legend itself. Miguel bent down to examine them, taking careful notes in his notebook. Every detail mattered. He moved closer to the edge of the well, shining his flashlight into the dark water. The surface reflected his light like black glass, smooth and still. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the quiet and the darkness that made the well seem deeper, almost alive. He remembered the stories about the Apache Siren and the warnings that those who approached too closely could fall victim to unseen dangers. He reminded himself to stay alert. One wrong step could lead to a serious fall or a surprise encounter with a rattlesnake. Suddenly, Miguel heard a faint sound, barely audible over the quiet desert night. At first, he thought it was the wind, moving through the rocks and bushes. But then the sound grew clearer, a soft, haunting melody, almost like someone singing far away. Miguel froze. His heart began to race. The singing was not loud, but it carried a strange power, drawing him forward even as his mind screamed to stay back. Could this be the Apache Siren? He did not know. Legends were usually exaggerated, but something about this moment felt real, almost tangible. Miguel took a slow, careful step toward the sound, shining his flashlight in the direction it came from. The melody seemed to shift, moving across the desert as if it were alive. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, making him think he saw movement in the bushes or on the rocks. He focused on staying calm, reminding himself to observe everything logically. The desert had many natural explanations for strange sounds and movements. Wind, animals, echoes, but he could not shake the feeling that something unusual was happening tonight. He crouched near a cluster of rocks to get a better view. The singing stopped suddenly, replaced by an almost total silence that felt heavier than the darkness itself. Miguel held his breath, listening. Then he heard it again, softer this time, coming from a slightly different direction. His flashlight revealed nothing but rocks, sand, and desert plants. He knew he was close to the well, and the terrain here was dangerous. One misstep could send him sliding into a hidden pit or brushing against a rattlesnake. Despite the fear creeping into his mind, he moved carefully, documenting every sound and shadow. As he circled the well, Miguel noticed something odd. There were small, shallow depressions in the ground, almost like footprints, but too irregular to belong to a human. He knelt down, brushing the sand with his fingers. The marks were recent, and they led toward a narrow path that disappeared into the darkness. A wave of curiosity washed over him. Who or what had made these tracks? Could it be someone playing a prank, or something more mysterious? He did not have an answer, but he knew he had to follow the trail carefully. Miguel's flashlight beam caught the glint of something reflective among the rocks. He approached slowly, discovering a small metallic object half buried in the sand. It looked like a key or a piece of old jewelry, tarnished by the desert sun and wind. He picked it up and examined it, feeling a connection to the people who had been here before. Whoever they were, they had faced the same fears and the same mystery that now surrounded him. This small object, seemingly ordinary, reminded him that the desert held secrets that could last for decades, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. Time passed slowly as Miguel continued to explore around the well. The night deepened, and the stars shone brightly above, illuminating the desert with silver light. He noticed the way the shadows moved, how the air felt heavier in certain spots, and how even the slightest noise seemed amplified. Every sound made him pause. The rustle of a snake in the brush, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whisper of wind through the rocks. Miguel reminded himself to stay focused. He was not here to panic. He was here to observe, to understand, and to document the truth behind the legend. Then something truly unexpected happened. A sudden movement caught his eye, a figure standing at the edge of his flashlight beam. Miguel froze, unsure if he had imagined it. The figure was tall, almost human in shape, but it disappeared as quickly as it appeared, melting into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. Could this be the Apache Siren? Or was it an animal? Or perhaps another person exploring the desert? He did not know, but the encounter confirmed what he had suspected. Rattlesnake Wells was not just a legend. It held real danger, and something in the night was waiting to challenge anyone who dared to come close. Miguel stepped back, keeping his flashlight steady. He listened carefully, trying to detect any movement. The desert had returned to its usual quiet, but now he knew he was not alone. Every sound, every shadow, seemed charged with meaning. The singing he had heard before returned briefly, a soft, haunting tune that seemed to circle around him. It was not loud, but it was enough to remind him that legends are born from fear and experience, often mixing the real and the imagined. He decided to move closer to the well itself. He kept low, careful to watch every step, avoiding loose rocks and potential snake hiding spots. The air around the well was cooler, heavier, and Miguel felt a strange tension pressing on him from all sides. He examined the edges of the well, shining his light into the dark water. The surface was calm, but the shadows inside made it impossible to see the bottom. He remembered the stories of people falling in or being pulled too close by the siren's call. Miguel shivered, realizing that he was testing his courage against both real danger and the power of a story that had frightened people for generations. Hours passed, and Miguel took careful notes, documenting every sound, shadow, and strange occurrence. The desert night was long, and he felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. His flashlight became his only guide, and the well became the center of his attention. He knew that this was just the beginning of the challenge. Whatever truth lay behind the Apache Siren, Miguel was determined to uncover it. He reminded himself that legends often mix danger with imagination, and only careful observation could separate fact from fiction. As midnight approached, Miguel realized he had to make a choice: retreat to safety or face the full challenge of the well. He knew that the desert would not reveal its secrets easily. He also knew that some dangers were real, like snakes and hidden pits, while others were born from fear, shadows, and the mind. With a deep breath, he prepared himself to confront the unknown, to test both his courage and his skills. Rattlesnake Wells was waiting, and Miguel was ready to take the next step into its mystery. Miguel's heart was still racing from the fleeting glimpse of the shadow near the well. The desert night seemed to grow darker and colder, as if it were testing him, daring him to step closer. He shined his flashlight carefully across the ground, scanning for movement, but nothing stirred. Only the sound of the wind brushing over rocks and the faint calls of distant coyotes filled the silence. Yet Miguel felt certain that he was not alone. The desert had a strange way of making the imagination mix with reality, but his training reminded him to stay focused and cautious. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the well. The ground was uneven, covered with loose sand, stones, and brittle desert plants. Every movement required concentration. A rattlesnake could be hidden under a bush or behind a rock. Miguel's instincts told him to move quietly and avoid making sudden noises. The air around the well was heavy, almost still, carrying the faint scent of earth and something older, something that belonged to the desert itself. He tried to focus on what he could see, not on what he imagined, but the feeling of being watched made every step tense and careful. As he reached the edge of the well, Miguel noticed more unusual marks in the sand. They looked like footprints, but they were irregular and too large to be human. They seemed to circle the well, appearing and disappearing as though someone, or something, had walked carefully to avoid leaving clear traces. Miguel crouched to examine them, brushing the sand gently with his fingers. He could see small scratches, possibly made by rocks or claws. This discovery made his heart beat faster. Whoever or whatever had left these marks had been here recently, and the evidence suggested a close connection to the legends he had heard. Then the air changed. A soft, haunting melody reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. It was the same song he had heard before, delicate and hypnotic, carried over the desert by the wind. Miguel froze, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The singing seemed to come from different directions at once, moving around him. It was almost impossible to tell where it began or ended. His mind raced. Was it the Apache Siren, calling to him as the legend said? Or was it something natural, a trick of the wind through the rocks? He could not tell. Yet the feeling of danger was real, pressing on him like the cold night air. Miguel took a deep breath and reminded himself of his purpose. He was here to observe, not to panic. Legends often grew from a mixture of real events and human imagination. Still, the desert was not forgiving, and he had to be careful. He moved closer to the well, keeping low, using the flashlight to illuminate the edges of the rocks and sand. Each step brought him nearer to the center, where the shadows seemed to grow thicker and the air colder. He noticed something strange. Small objects around the well, broken bottles, old pieces of clothing, and a few worn shoes. They told a story of people who had been here before him, some cautious, some careless, and some who had never returned. As he bent down to examine one of the objects, a faint movement caught his eye. A shadow slipped across the desert floor, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Miguel's pulse quickened. He raised his flashlight, sweeping it slowly over the ground. Nothing. Only the familiar rocks and desert plants stared back at him. Yet he knew he had seen something. He reminded himself to stay calm. The desert night was full of tricks, shadows, echoes, and reflections that could fool even the most experienced observer. But his instincts told him that this time the danger was real. Suddenly, the singing returned, louder now, closer, as if the voice were just beyond the edge of his flashlight beam. Miguel's eyes widened. He could not see anyone, but the sound seemed to draw him toward the center of the well. He realized that this was the Apache Siren's challenge, a test of courage and caution. Those who allowed fear or curiosity to control their steps risked falling into hidden traps, encountering venomous snakes, or losing their way in the darkness. Miguel felt a mix of fear and determination. He would not be lured blindly. He would face the challenge carefully and with respect for the desert. He circled the well slowly, keeping his attention on the ground. He noticed a small depression near the edge, a hidden pit that could have been fatal for anyone unaware. It was partially covered by sand, invisible without careful observation. Miguel marked it mentally, realizing that many of the disappearances attributed to the Apache Siren were likely the result of natural hazards, amplified by fear. The desert was full of secrets, and the well had claimed the careless or unlucky. But now Miguel was alert, prepared, and determined not to become another story. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of shadows and faint sounds. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wet earth from a hidden spring nearby. The singing grew intermittent, sometimes near, sometimes far, always haunting, always mysterious. Miguel followed it carefully, noting every change in direction, every variation in tone. He discovered more evidence of previous visitors, small items left behind, footprints circling and disappearing, and faint marks that suggested careful movements around the dangerous terrain. Each clue reminded him that the legend of the Apache Siren was built on real danger, combined with fear and imagination. At one point, Miguel stopped to rest near a rock. He drank some water and examined his notes. The desert was quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of a small animal and the distant calls of night birds. He reflected on the people who had come here before him. Some had been fearless, some reckless, and some cautious like him. Yet the desert treated them all the same, rewarding attention and punishing carelessness. Miguel realized that the Apache Siren legend served a purpose. It warned people of real danger while cloaking it in mystery. But tonight, he wanted to understand both the legend and the reality. As midnight passed, Miguel felt a growing sense of connection to the desert. The shadows, the cold, and the singing were no longer just frightening. They were alive with meaning. He began to notice subtle patterns, the way the wind shifted through rocks, the slight movement of plants, and the faint tracks that appeared and disappeared in the sand. Each detail mattered. He knew that by observing carefully he could separate real hazards from imagined threats. Yet he also knew that the legend held power, and part of the challenge was facing his own fear in the darkness. Then, a sudden sound made him freeze, a soft rustle, close to the well, like footsteps brushing against rocks. Miguel raised his flashlight, sweeping it slowly across the desert floor. For a moment he saw movement, something dark, human-shaped, slipping behind a rock. His heart pounded, but he reminded himself to stay calm. The desert was testing him, and fear could make the difference between safety and danger. He slowly moved closer, keeping low, watching every shadow, noting every sound, and staying aware of the hidden pits and snakes that could strike without warning. The minutes stretched into an hour as Miguel explored carefully. The singing returned one last time, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. He realized that the Apache Siren's challenge was not just about danger from the desert or snakes. It was about testing courage, patience, and observation. Those who rushed, ignored danger, or allowed fear to control them would be lost. Those who moved carefully, thought clearly, and respected the desert could survive and learn its secrets. Miguel smiled slightly, knowing he was part of a long chain of people facing the same test, and he was determined to succeed. As the first hint of dawn touched the desert horizon, Miguel took a step back from the well. He had survived the night, observed every shadow and sound, and documented every clue. The singing had faded, the desert was quiet, and the well looked ordinary in the soft light of morning. But Miguel knew better. The Apache Siren was not just a ghost story. It was a test of courage and attention, wrapped in the power of legend. He felt a mixture of relief, pride, and curiosity. The well had challenged him, but he had learned its secrets and survived. Miguel packed his equipment carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. He walked slowly back to his truck, glancing at the desert one last time. He knew that Rattlesnake Wells would always hold its mysteries, but he had proven to himself that careful observation, preparation, and courage could reveal the truth behind even the most frightening legends. The desert had tested him, and he had passed, ready for the next stage of his adventure, deeper into the story of the Apache Siren and the hidden dangers of the midnight desert. The desert was quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of early morning. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the red rocks and sand, making the shadows shrink and the landscape appear almost peaceful. Miguel Santos sat on a nearby rock, taking a moment to catch his breath and reflect on the night he had just survived. The Apache Siren legend had tested him in ways he had never imagined. The singing, the shadows, and the strange movements near Rattlesnake Wells had challenged his courage and forced him to be careful with every step. But, as he looked around, Miguel realized that there was more to the story than just fear and superstition. He packed his notes and photographs carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. As he walked back toward the main dirt road, he thought about what the local elders had told him years ago. The stories of the Apache tribe, their traditions, and their sacred sites hidden across the desert. The Apache had respected the land, and the well might have been a place of significance for them. The legend of the siren, Miguel realized, might have grown from both the natural dangers of the desert and the tribe's stories warning travelers to be cautious at night. Miguel returned to his truck and drove to a small nearby town, where he planned to speak with local historians and elders who still remembered the old stories. He parked near a small cafe and looked around. The town was quiet in the morning, with a few early risers heading to work. Miguel entered the cafe and asked about the Apache Siren. An older man named Joseph, who had spent most of his life studying the desert and the tribe's history, invited Miguel to sit down. Joseph began to explain what he knew. The Apache were careful with their land, he said, his voice low but steady. There were places that were sacred or dangerous, and Rattlesnake Wells was one of them. The stories of a female spirit, what people now call the Apache Siren, were meant to warn people. Sometimes she represents danger, sometimes caution. But the desert itself is dangerous, especially at night. Many people went missing there not because of ghosts, but because of snakes, hidden pits, and the isolation. Miguel listened carefully, taking notes. Everything Joseph said confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The legend was rooted in truth, but it had been shaped by fear and imagination over generations. People had added details to make it more frightening. The singing voice, the mysterious shadow, the hypnotic pull toward the well. Yet beneath it all, there was a simple lesson: respect the desert and always be prepared for its dangers. After the conversation, Miguel visited a small local museum that housed artifacts from the Apache tribe. He examined old pottery, tools, and writings, trying to understand how the well might have been used. He learned that water sources were sacred in the desert, not only because of their rarity, but because they were central to survival. Apache stories often warned of spirits at wells and springs, but these were meant as protective tales. They were reminders that travelers needed to be careful, to observe the land, and not take unnecessary risks. That afternoon, Miguel returned to Rattlesnake Wells to explore further, this time in daylight. The desert looked entirely different under the sun. Shadows that had seemed ominous the night before were just rocks and desert plants. The small pits and uneven ground were easier to see, and the rattlesnakes that had been hidden in the darkness were now sunbathing safely away from his path. Miguel carefully mapped the area, noting every potential hazard and marking safe paths for future travelers. He even found a small, narrow cave near the well, partially hidden by rocks. It looked dangerous but also mysterious, and he realized that people might have mistaken it for part of the siren legend at night. As he examined the cave, Miguel noticed faint symbols etched into the walls. They were worn by time, almost impossible to read without close attention. Using his camera, he photographed each mark. He speculated that they might have been used for rituals or to mark something important, perhaps a warning for travelers. The cave, the well, and the surrounding rocks told a story of careful observation and respect for the land. The Apache Siren legend, Miguel now understood, was a way to preserve that knowledge through generations. While documenting everything, Miguel reflected on the people who had disappeared near the well. Some had been reckless, ignoring the natural dangers, while others had been unlucky. But the legend had given the desert a personality, a presence that made people pay attention. The stories of the singing, the shadow, and the hypnotic call were reminders that fear, when used carefully, could be a tool for survival. Miguel realized that the night he had spent at the well had been both a personal challenge and a lesson in respecting history and nature. As he packed up to leave, Miguel noticed the sun was beginning to set. The desert took on its evening colors, warm reds and golds blending into deep blue shadows. He decided to stay one more night at the well, but this time with more preparation. He set up a small camp nearby, keeping his equipment close. Unlike the first night, he felt more confident. He knew the dangers, understood the history, and was ready to face the darkness with both caution and curiosity. That night, as the stars appeared above, Miguel observed the desert carefully. The singing returned, soft and distant, but this time he felt no fear. He understood that it was part of the legend, part of the desert's way of teaching respect. Shadows moved in the moonlight, but he knew what to watch for: snakes, pits, and hidden rocks. The night was long, but Miguel's confidence grew. He took careful notes, made sketches of the terrain, and even captured photographs of strange shadows that had appeared during the previous night. By the end of the night, Miguel felt a strong connection to the land. He realized that the Apache Siren was not a threat to fear blindly, but a reminder of the desert's power. Legends had preserved knowledge about real dangers in a way that could be remembered for generations. Miguel's respect for the desert had deepened. He also understood that anyone venturing into these remote areas needed preparation, awareness, and courage. The desert could be beautiful, mysterious, and dangerous, all at once. The next morning, Miguel drove back to town with a sense of accomplishment. He had survived the midnight challenge, observed the legend in action, and uncovered the real history behind the Apache Siren. He planned to share his findings with local authorities and the community to warn travelers and preserve the stories. He realized that legends were not just tales. They were lessons passed down through time, blending reality and imagination to protect those who came after. As he looked back at the desert from a distance, Miguel felt a mixture of awe and respect. The well, the rocks, and the hidden dangers had taught him more than any story could. He understood now that the Apache Siren was a guide in disguise, a challenge that tested courage, observation, and respect. The desert had given him a lesson in patience, awareness, and humility. Miguel knew he would return to Rattlesnake Wells again, not to chase the legend, but to honor it and to make sure that others could safely experience the mysteries of the desert. Miguel Santos returned to the desert with a sense of purpose. After his previous nights of exploration and discovery, he knew that Rattlesnake Wells was more than just a legend. It was a place full of real dangers and deep history. This time he brought a small team with him, 2 fellow desert rangers and a local historian. He wanted to map the area carefully, mark hazards, and ensure that future travelers could visit safely without being drawn into unnecessary danger. The Apache Siren legend, Miguel realized, was a story with a lesson, and he wanted to respect it while protecting others. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the desert. The team parked their trucks a safe distance from the well and carried their equipment: ropes, first aid kits, cameras, notebooks, and markers to identify hazards. Miguel felt confident. He had learned the well's secrets, the dangerous areas, and the places where people had gone missing before. But he also knew that the desert demanded respect. Even experienced travelers could be caught off guard by rattlesnakes, hidden pits, or uneven ground. Miguel led the team to the edge of the well. He pointed out the small depressions, the uneven rocks, and the hidden cracks in the ground that could easily be missed. His companions listened carefully, impressed by the thoroughness of his observations. Miguel explained the legend of the Apache Siren and how the stories had been shaped over generations. "The siren is not just a ghost," he said. "She represents caution, respect, and awareness. The desert itself is alive and dangerous. If we ignore it, we pay the price." As they explored, the team discovered the small cave Miguel had found on his previous visit. The historian examined the faint markings on the walls and speculated that they had been made by the Apache, perhaps as a warning to travelers. Miguel took photographs and made sketches. He felt a deep sense of respect for the tribe and the knowledge they had passed down. The desert had always been harsh, but the Apache had learned to survive by observing carefully and respecting the land. The legend of the siren was a continuation of that tradition, teaching caution in a way that people would remember. Night began to fall, and Miguel set up a small campsite near the well. He made sure the team was safe, with tents and flashlights ready, and emphasized the importance of staying alert. The desert grew colder as the stars appeared overhead, shining like diamonds against the black sky. Miguel reflected on his experiences from the previous nights. The shadows that had seemed alive, the singing that had carried across the desert, and the hidden dangers he had discovered. Everything made sense now. The siren's call was a challenge, a test of attention, courage, and respect for the desert. As darkness deepened, Miguel decided to conduct one final observation. He and one ranger moved carefully around the well, checking for hazards and documenting the terrain. The singing returned briefly, faint and distant, but Miguel no longer felt fear. He understood it as part of the legend's teaching. Shadows moved across the desert floor, but he knew they were only rocks, plants, and the shifting light of their flashlights. Every movement, every sound was carefully noted in his notebook. The desert was alive, and they were witnesses to its beauty and danger. The night passed without incident, and by the early morning Miguel had completed a full survey of the area. He had identified the most dangerous spots, mapped safe paths, and documented everything for future travelers. He felt a sense of accomplishment. The Apache Siren legend was no longer just a frightening story. It had become a lesson in preparation, respect, and awareness. He knew that people would continue to tell stories of the siren, but now the stories could include guidance, not just fear. Miguel gathered the team and discussed the importance of sharing their findings. They planned to work with local authorities to place clear warning signs around the well and mark the most dangerous areas. The goal was not to destroy the legend, but to respect it while preventing accidents. Miguel explained that the desert demanded attention and that legends like the Apache Siren were tools for survival, teaching people to be alert and careful. His companions nodded, understanding the importance of preserving both safety and cultural history. As the sun rose fully over the desert, casting warm light across the red rocks and sand, Miguel took a moment to reflect. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and taught him lessons that went beyond fear. He had learned about the land, the people who had lived there before, and the way stories could protect and guide travelers. The Apache Siren was not gone. She lived in the shadows, the wind, and the quiet dangers of the desert. But now Miguel understood her purpose: to remind humans that courage, preparation, and respect were essential for survival. Miguel also thought about the people who had disappeared near Rattlesnake Wells. Some had been careless, ignoring obvious dangers. Others had been unlucky, encountering hazards hidden by darkness. But the legend of the siren had ensured that the well remained feared, keeping most people away. Miguel felt a mix of sorrow and respect. The desert was beautiful but unforgiving, and the siren legend had preserved the memory of those who had been lost, teaching future travelers to be cautious. Before leaving, Miguel and his team took one final walk around the well. They marked the paths they had surveyed, set up temporary warnings, and made detailed notes for local authorities. The desert was calm, the sun warm on their faces, and the shadows short and safe in the daylight. Miguel felt a deep satisfaction. He had faced the legend, understood its history, and turned a story of fear into one of knowledge and safety. The Apache Siren would continue to be a part of local culture, but now her message was clear: respect the desert, observe carefully, and never underestimate its power. As Miguel drove away from Rattlesnake Wells, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the desert stretching endlessly behind him. The well was just a small feature in the vast landscape, but it held a story that had lasted for generations. He thought of the singing, the shadows, and the hidden dangers, understanding that legends are not just entertainment. They are lessons passed down to protect and guide. Miguel felt proud of his work, knowing that he had added to that legacy, combining courage, observation, and respect for the land. The desert road stretched ahead, quiet except for the hum of the truck's engine. Miguel reflected on how much he had learned. The Apache Siren was real in a way that mattered, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of the desert's challenges. The midnight calls, the shadows, and the mysterious sounds were all part of a test, designed to teach travelers awareness and caution. Miguel knew that the desert would always hold mysteries, but he had discovered the balance between legend and reality, fear and understanding. By the time he reached the small town, the day was fully awake, and life had returned to its normal rhythm. Miguel felt a sense of peace. The well, the legend, and the desert had changed him. He had faced his fears, understood the history, and turned a dangerous story into a lesson for others. He knew that future travelers would continue to speak of the Apache Siren, but now the story would carry wisdom as well as mystery. As he sat in a quiet cafe, drinking water and reviewing his notes, Miguel realized that the desert had given him more than a challenge. It had given him insight into human courage, the power of legends, and the importance of respect. He thought of the travelers who would one day visit Rattlesnake Wells, now safer and wiser because of his work. And in the back of his mind, he smiled, knowing that somewhere in the desert, the Apache Siren was still singing her haunting song, reminding humans that the land must always be approached with care. Miguel packed his notes and photographs one last time. He felt ready to share his findings with the wider community, to warn travelers, and to honor the history of the Apache people. Rattlesnake Wells had been a test, a teacher, and a mystery. The legend of the siren would live on, not just as a tale of fear, but as a story of respect, courage, and survival. Miguel knew that he had completed his journey, but the desert would continue to hold secrets, waiting for those brave enough to learn from them. As he drove away from the desert, Miguel glanced one last time at the horizon. The sun shone brightly, the wind moved gently through the desert, and the well stood quietly, holding its stories and mysteries. The Apache Siren had completed her task, testing, warning, and protecting. And Miguel knew that, like the well, the desert itself was a teacher, offering lessons to anyone willing to observe, respect, and survive.